Huh? It's 5:04 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Yesterday, the North Carolina State Board of Elections, the NCSBE, voted largely along party lines to reject election protests from Republican Supreme Court candidate Judge Jefferson Griffin, as well as 3 GOP legislative candidates. Griffin sought to invalidate over 60,000 ballots in the high-stakes race for the top judicial seat in our state, where Democrat incumbent Allison Riggs led by 734 votes after a machine recount. Riggs gained 14 additional votes in a partial hand-eye recount that took place over the last couple of weeks, and with that, there was no need for a full statewide recount. The board also dismissed challenges related to voter eligibility, including ballots from military and overseas voters, individuals with incomplete registration records, we'll get into that a little bit later on this morning, and voters challenged post-election. Democrats criticized the notification process, which involved postcards with QR codes, as ineffective and confusing, while Republicans defended it as minimally compliant. Concerns were raised about disenfranchisement of eligible voters, with Democrats emphasizing that many targeted voters had participated in prior elections without issue, even though they did not have the proper information, which is required by federal law under HAVA. The board unanimously upheld voter ID requirements for future elections, but reiterated the importance of protecting voting rights. Griffin and other GOP candidates still have the opportunity to appeal the decision in court, with options to escalate to first Wake County Superior Court and then likely the state Supreme Court. We don't know whether that's going to happen. In response to this, the North Carolina Republican Party released the following statement saying, quote, "Today, the North Carolina Republican Party issues this statement, quote, unsurprisingly, the most partisan state board of elections in history has once again failed the people of North Carolina. The board's continued efforts to engineer political outcomes for Democrats is shameful. We will review the board's decision and reserve the right to any future actions to protest the integrity of our elections." That's an end quote there from NCGOP Chairman Jason Simmons. The statement goes on to say, as stated previously, these protests highlight specific irregularities and discrepancies in the handling and counting of ballots, raising concerns about the adherence to established election laws. These challenges are part of lawful and transparent processes designed to uphold voter confidence in the system. As of this morning, this decision came down about 3:30, 4 o'clock yesterday. As of 5:07 this morning, we do not have any decisions from any of the candidates, including Judge Jefferson Griffin, whether legal challenge will go forward. We'll chat about the practicality of doing that with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation coming up for you a little bit later on this morning. It's now 5:08 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Yesterday, it was the North Carolina House that had the opportunity to deal with another veto override, Senate Bill 382. To get some additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, Brianna Kramer from CarolinaJournal.com. She was actually at the General Assembly yesterday as this event took place. Brianna, good morning to you. Tell us a little bit about what you saw down at the GA yesterday.
Hey, Nick. Yes, the North Carolina House voted to override Governor Roy Cooper's veto of Senate Bill 382 on Wednesday, and they voted in a 72-46 vote, and that officially makes the legislation law here in North Carolina. Last month in November, both the House and Senate did vote to pass this legislation, but the governor vetoed it, and so it came down to the wire last week when the Senate overrided the veto, and now this week the House, we weren't sure if they were going to have enough votes to get it past the finish line as the year is coming to an end, but they did have enough votes on Wednesday to get it through.
This bill includes some $227 million in additional monies for disaster relief, but it does also include some other things that caused it to rise to this level of controversy. I think the biggest one, and the one that folks are talking about, is moving the State Board of Elections out from under the administrative branch of the governor and moving that to the state auditor's office. Brianna, and you're reporting on this and covering this over the last few weeks. Is that really the thing that's sticking most with people?
Yes, definitely that. So, they like to talk, Republicans are talking about how this is more disaster relief because there's $227 million allocated for Western North Carolina. However, that money is not specifically going anywhere yet. So that's the criticism from Democrats, is that this still has to be appropriated somewhere. But at least that money is now set aside. So that does bring aid to over $1 billion from the General Assembly now. But as you mentioned, yes, the North Carolina State Board of Elections, the authority over that board is now going to be transferred from the governor to the state auditor, who is set to be Republican Dave Bullock in January. So basically, they're stripping the governor of some of his powers, and they're giving that to a different state official. And that has really raised a lot of alarms because it's really just benefiting Republicans and giving them more power in the new year when they're set to lose their supermajority.
Let's talk a little bit about the atmosphere at the General Assembly. For folks that tuned in and watched the live stream of the session, there was a lot of crowd activity going on, a typical chants of shame from members in the gallery. You were there. What exactly was that like as you were there in person?
Yeah, so demonstrators showed up all afternoon waiting around. Legislators were delayed. They had a committee meeting, and that was about an hour delayed, and then they were slow to get to the floor as well to do their final votes. And so people were waiting around. Everybody had signs upstairs, and everybody was there to, protest and to make their voices heard against the bill, on the Democrat side. And yeah, after it passed, they were upstairs yelling shame, shame, and people were not happy. And there was a lot of people making their voices heard. And so we've seen a lot of criticism over the past month when the Senate was in session voting. The same thing happened. Protesters showed up and they were kicked out of the chamber as well. But their criticism did not stop Republicans from getting it past the finish line.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up. Republicans are now 29 for 29 in veto overrides over the last couple of sessions, and this has got to be a brutal situation for Democrats, especially Governor Roy Cooper, to be dealing with. Anything that he vetoes, the General Assembly is overriding, and as you just mentioned, that is likely to change pretty significantly here in just a couple of weeks when we head into the new year.
Yes, that's right. It's been convenient. This session, Republicans have had just enough seats held to override the governor basically at any point that they've wanted to. And so now going into the new year, they're going to be missing just one seat needed. And so they'll have to maybe negotiate a little bit more with Democrats or work across the aisle a little bit more in order to push some other legislation through. They may have to compromise a little bit more.
That was not the only thing that the House dealt with today. There was some constitutional amendments that you and I talked about last week that came out of the Senate. The House moved forward with those as well?
Yes, one of them actually. Senate Bill 921, that was approved by the House in a 73-45 vote, and that's a constitutional amendment proposal to require photo ID for all voters in North Carolina. That's already state law here, but they really just want to make sure it's in the Constitution and that it's clarified that you need photo ID, not just for in-person voting, but for absentee voting and mail-in ballots as well. And so Republicans were saying it's pretty straightforward. It says, or does exactly what the title says, and it's just to clarify that voter ID is law for all types of voters here. But Democrats that were critical of it said that it's unnecessary. It could confuse people and it could stifle people from wanting to use mail-in ballots. And then the Democrats criticizing it also noted that not everyone has access to make a copy of their ID if they're voting by mail. So that did pass. So that will be on the ballot in 2026. so a long time ahead still. But the other constitutional amendment that senators brought up last week, Senate Bill 920, that was going to cap the income tax rate at 5% instead of 7%, so they were going to lower it. But the House did not bring that to the floor today, and so it looks like that's not going to make it through.
A lot of great information this morning. Brianna Kramer joins us from CarolinaJournal.com. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. A look at traffic on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We have an issue.
It's 5:19. You're listening to a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live, as always, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel this morning as well. You can take the show with you on your own time by downloading our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app. Well, our top story this morning does continue to be movement out of the North Carolina General Assembly yesterday. The House has overridden Governor Roy Cooper's veto of Senate Bill 382. And with the Senate doing that last week, that legislation is now law. The bill provides $227 million in additional disaster relief for Western North Carolina, which brings state aid to over $1 billion. They've done that through 3 legislative measures since the storm ravaged portions of Western North Carolina. However, the bill also includes significant changes to state government powers, reallocating control of the State Board of Elections and other executive authorities, which Democrats view as a political power grab ahead of Republicans losing their supermajority as we head into the 2025 long session. The legislation eliminates 2 Democrat-held judgeships and creates new positions appointed by the Republican-led legislature. The House and Senate also approved a constitutional amendment requiring photo identification for all voters, aligning the Constitution with already existing state law. Critics, of course, argue that the amendment could deter voters and create confusion, as they say any time that Republicans touch voter identification. While polls broadly indicate support for stricter voter ID laws, 70% of those polled are in favor of those laws. Protesters accompanied legislative action at the General Assembly yesterday, which does continue and will likely continue into the long session. And what we saw yesterday was likely the final action for the North Carolina General Assembly, barring some additional session called in the next week or so, which seems highly unlikely at this point. That is the last that we will see from this session. New members will be sworn in portions of early January, and as we have reported on since Election Day, it does appear that Republicans will be about 1 vote short in the North Carolina House in regards to their supermajority. However, we've heard from Destin Hall, who is set to be the new Speaker of the House as we head into that next session. He claims that they will have a working supermajority. With that, Governor Roy Cooper put out this post last night on his X account, a short image with not even a quote, it's just a statement that says, Western North Carolina small businesses and communities still wait for support from the legislature while Republicans make political power grabs the priority. Shameful. Now, it is not quoted Roy Cooper, and it is tagged Office of Governor Roy Cooper. That is what we are hearing from the governor's office this morning. Likely some more reaction and fallout throughout the day in the next couple of days. We'll continue to track it over at carolinajournal.com, where you can keep up to date with statewide news throughout the day. And, of course, here each and every weekday morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:23, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We've got an update this morning on a meeting that took place yesterday afternoon surrounding the State Board of Elections and some election protests brought forward by Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin, he the Republican in that race. To get some more details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation. Andy, we have talked a lot about this Supreme Court race over the last month or so. Since the general election, the Republican candidate is down about 730 votes. There was some election ballot protests, and the state board, I guess, met to discuss some of those yesterday. What exactly are you tracking this morning?
Well, yesterday they had a meeting of the State Board of Elections. This was the second meeting on the issue, where basically they were going to decide if they were going to go forward with the protests themselves. So this wasn't really about the protests. This was deciding if they were going to hear the protest or try to adjudicate them. So the Griffin campaign was seeking to have several classes of ballots taken out. Some of them were from people who have never been North Carolina residents, many of whom have never stepped foot in North Carolina, but whose parents were at one point residents of North Carolina, and now they and their kids live overseas. There was another one dealing with voter ID for overseas and military ballots, but the single biggest group by far were voter registrations that do not have either a driver's license number or social security number as required by law. The bulk of the roughly 60,000 protests that the Griffin campaign had given to the State Board of Elections were on that one issue. And this is something that the State Board has been dealing with, or really more accurately say, not been dealing with for over a year. There have been complaints that the State Board hasn't been acting to get those numbers from those registrants, and the State Board acknowledged that in the sense that they've changed their form to let people know who are newly registering that those numbers are required, but they haven't taken concrete action to get those numbers from those that are currently registered.
Andy, I'd like to quote you yourself in a post on X yesterday. You said that the State Board of Elections screwed the pooch in regards to these. Does this have anything to do with, and I think we've talked about this maybe back a couple of months ago, with some federal regulations and some voting acts that were passed federally back in the early 2000s that required this information? Is that where a lot of this surrounds?
Yes, this comes from HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, or Help Americans Vote Act, I forget which. And this is part of federal law. State law was changed to fit with federal law. And this is a way of helping states maintain accurate voter rolls. Now, the State Board of Elections assigns numbers to everybody, but the problem is those numbers aren't in agreement with those of any other state. You can't really use them to go with any other databases. If you were checking, say, Social Security death rolls, for example, or other kinds of databases to make sure that the voter rolls were accurate. And that's the reason that that various complainers had asked the State Board of Elections to go ahead and try to get those numbers. And this is something that was also part of a lawsuit. The Republican Party had sued the State Board of Elections, I think it was several weeks ago, or several weeks before the election, asking the State Board to either not accept ballots from those registrations, which would have been an extreme example, something I wouldn't have agreed with, or to make those provisional until those numbers are submitted. The State Board has refused to do that. The court did not order that, and so here we are today, and it is kind of almost finally decided by the State Board of Elections, although there could be an appeal.
Andy, are these older registrants that don't have their information on file, or are these people that are new to the state? It seems to me that if you've moved to the state in the last decade and registered to become a voter, you probably have all of this information in. Who are these tens of thousands of individuals that don't have this required data from the federal government on file here in North Carolina, or is it kind of a mishmash of everybody?
It is a mismatch. I mean, because the State Board really had essentially a bad form where it made it look like the information wasn't required because you have to have either your driver's license number or the last four of your social security number. And they didn't emphasized the or in there, and that confused people. Plus, since neither one of them are required, since you could have one or the other, you have to have one or the other, but you don't have to have both. For example, the State Board did not mark that red like they do other required information. And so this is something that's been ongoing, I want to say, since 2004, 2005, when HAVA became federal law, when they were supposed to be getting this information. And so there's really, I want to say about 200,000. There's tens of thousands of registrations that don't have this information, ranging from the mid-2000s till last year, for example. And so this has been a reoccurring problem that the State Board hasn't addressed, county boards haven't addressed. Hopefully, these protests, if they don't accomplish anything else, it'll be a kick in the pants for the State Board to go ahead and make an earnest effort to collect that information.
We'll continue the conversation and talk about how this is all in reference to the North Carolina Supreme Court race coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at your roadways on a Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Good Thursday morning to you. Appreciate you spending some time with us. Leaders of the North Carolina General Assembly earlier this week traveled to Washington, D.C. That was back on Tuesday, where they met with Senators Thom Tillis and Ted Budd amid ongoing calls for Congress to provide immediate assistance to North Carolinians that continue to deal with the impacts of Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina. And it was quite the list of individuals that traveled up to D.C. It included the Senate President and Phil Berger, Rules Chairman Senator Bill Rabon from Brunswick County, House of Representatives Speaker Tim Moore, as well as Speaker-elect Destin Hall. They visited the nation's capital, joined by other state individuals, including Representative Dudley Green, who we'll hear from a little bit later on in the final segment this morning, as well as Senators Ralph Heiss, both of them from western North Carolina, Avery and Mitchell County, respectively. The state leaders also plan to hold a series of meetings with federal officials and lawmakers to underscore the necessity for that increased support in disaster relief, as well as expedited FEMA assistance. In a statement that says this, quote, "We are fully committed to doing everything in our power to ensure that Congress passes disaster relief as quickly as possible so western North Carolina can begin long-term recovery process." That's from both Senators Tillis and Budd. North Carolina's congressional and NCGA leaders have worked closely together since the beginning, and we are all on the same page. The need to pass legislation at state and federal levels to cut red tape and deliver much-needed assistance to western North Carolina. The delegation urged Congress and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to take swift and decisive action to aid communities that were devastated by Helene. In a press release, Tillis highlighted several initiatives that leaders have been advocating for since October to support western North Carolina. Letters of urgency describing the need for action have been sent to the Senate appropriation leaders, the White House, and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. With that, Tillis attempted to pass legislation to replenish the Small Business Administration and their disaster loan program on the Senate floor, but those efforts were blocked. The Relief Act was then introduced on November the 18th, but no further action has been taken since then. We are running up against a government shutdown. That's going to take place next week, and there is a possibility that some of this disaster relief is added in as part of that CR, that continuing resolution. So that is probably the last chance that western North Carolina is going to have in terms of relief from this current sitting Congress. If not, it will be the next administration. That, of course, will be led by President-elect Donald Trump and Republicans that will be controlling both the House and the Senate in Washington, D.C. We'll keep a close eye on it and pass details along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:39, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Continuing our conversation this morning with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation about yesterday's North Carolina State Board of Elections meeting. This was, of course, brought forward by Republican Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin, challenging about 60,000 ballots. As you mentioned previously, Andy, the State Board of Election in their meeting yesterday essentially chose not to move forward, I guess indicating they didn't have enough evidence to move forward on some of these ballot challenges. So is it accurate to say that as we chat this morning, that race for Supreme Court is over and the Democrat is victorious by about 734 votes?
Well, it's kind of done, but it's not done. There's always the route of lawsuits. Now, first of all, the Republicans, Griffin and some other state candidates for the General Assembly, could appeal directly. That's already in statute. They could appeal directly into the court system, and it goes that way, or they could file a lawsuit separately. That may happen. Certainly Republicans would prefer this to be handled in state court because they do currently have a 5-2 majority. If this thing goes all the way up to the state Supreme Court, there's a 5-2 Republican majority there. I would imagine if it went that far, Riggs would have to recuse herself. But since there's already a strong Republican majority, that wouldn't make that much of a difference. I'm not really sure, though, if the Republicans are going to take that next step. The party said in an immediate response to the State Board of Elections ruling, they said, well, they're going to be considering their options. That's not a strong statement like saying, oh, we're definitely going to take this to the next level. They're probably going to talk with Griffin, talk with the other candidates, decide if it is worth it. And really, they have to decide is it worth it politically to go there and try to toss 55, 65, or 60,000 ballots, most of whom, at least in appearance, are legitimate voters who just happen to be missing information. Are they really going to toss those ballots? And I think it's probably a bad look for the state. At some point, or I should say a bad look for the Griffin campaign and the Republicans if they pursued that route. At some point, we're going to have to get this mess fixed, but this is probably not the right venue for that.
I want to touch on that in a second, but I think as you talk about kind of the political optics of this, and Andy, you've mentioned this in the past, let's say this were to go to a court and a judge was to say, yeah, we need more information on it. These voters presumably would have the opportunity to verify who they were in front of the State Board of Elections before their ballots were completely tossed. So you could go through this entire process, and you're not going to have 60,000 votes likely thrown out. And even with that, you still can end up losing the race. We don't know who these voters are.
Right. And that's an issue. And especially in the Trump era, we're seeing a lot of times where actually an expanded electorate is good for Republicans, certainly good for kind of Trump style Republicans. And so, yeah, I just don't know if they have the appetite to do that. And plus, there's no way they can show that they're going to be successful if they did. But there's a logistical hurdle there. You're looking at, we'll just say for the sake of example, 55,000. You're looking at 55,000 ballots across the state where the counties would have to contact these people. They may not be successful in contacting those folks. And so even if they were successful in getting that information from everybody that has it, you could still end up losing, 5, 6, 7, 10,000 votes. And I think a lot of people would say, well, that's not really fair for people that who are really victims of an administrative problem that the state board and the county boards have put on them. And again, this needs to be fixed, but this is really on the election officials rather than the voters.
Well, and let me ask you about that. This obviously needs to be fixed. This is something that has been well known for quite some time. Who needs to do this? I mean, is this wholly something that the State Board of Elections needs to deal with? Does the General Assembly need to demand that the State Board of Elections get on this? Does the incoming Josh Stein campaign? Who exactly needs to kind of put their foot down and say, Andy, let's get this squared away. We've got all these voters. We need to exactly verify who they are and get their correct information.
Well, frankly, this might be something that ends up getting settled in the near future. If the state board decides that they've had enough of a hassle dealing with this now, they might say, okay, well, let's go ahead and actually make an earnest effort to get that information. There's a couple of ways they could do that. They could send out the typical cards that they send out to folks, or otherwise try to contact them. Or they could just go ahead and set up the list. This is something that the Republican Party had asked them to do in their lawsuit. Basically set it up so that if you come in and you're on the list of people that haven't provided this information, they ask you for the information and you give it. And that will be probably the most efficient way to do it. So it's just a matter of will on the State Board of Elections part, if they're going to go ahead and fix the problem rather than let this thing fester.
Well, that second idea that you just brought forward, now with voter ID requirements, one of the requirements is a driver's license number for this form. Presumably, Andy, you could kind of kill two birds with one stone there. Verify your voter ID and make sure that you've got the correct information on file, all with one state-issued ID from DMV.
Right. Well, that would be the simplest. And most people do present their driver's license. Now, there are some folks who present student IDs or tribal IDs, employee IDs, and those are all legal documents depending on, where you're employed and whatnot. But even most of those folks will have either a driver's license number or a state ID number, and failing that, the last four digits of their social. There is really a very small minority of people who have neither of those numbers, and then they have to make election officials aware of that. But for the vast majority of people that are on this list of tens of thousands of folks, this is a very fixable problem.
Great insight this morning. We'll continue to track the details. Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 546, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We're looking good on this. Hot.
It's 5:52. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Thursday morning to you. Recapping our top story this morning, this was a busy day in the General Assembly yesterday as the House overrode Governor Roy Cooper's veto of Senate Bill 382, enacting that legislation into law after the Senate did the same thing with SB 382 last week. That was last Monday for them. The bill provides $227 million in disaster relief for Western North Carolina, which brings state aid to over $1 billion through 3 legislative measures. We heard from Representative Dudley Green yesterday on the House floor. He represents House District 85, that is Avery County, which was incredibly hard hit. Representative Green talked about losing his house, having over 4 feet of water, completely destroying his house, his belongings, his property. And he talked a little bit about this relief and why the General Assembly is going at it the way that they are.
But one thing that I have learned in this whole process is if we outrun the federal government on what we can get reimbursed for, we're not going to be able to leverage those federal dollars in order to do what is right for Western North Carolina. And so I think that the folks who have dealt with these things before and have that understanding, and I appreciate them doing it, appropriations chairs, Representative Bell, you guys have been through this, you know how this federal reimbursement works. And I think this has been done in such a way that gives us the best chance to do that. Because this is a $50 billion incident. North Carolina has a $30 billion budget per year. So if we took our whole next year's budget and every penny of reserve we got, we don't have enough to pay for the recovery.
That's Representative Dudley Green, as you can hear in his voice. It was a pretty emotional speech that he gave on the House floor yesterday ahead of the veto override vote, talking about the process that he and his family went through back in September when this storm ravaged portions of Western North Carolina. Not only does the legislation allocate an additional $227 million, as I mentioned, but it also makes significant changes to powers within state government, including reallocating control of the State Board of Elections from the governor's office and moving that over to the state auditor's office. That will be controlled by Republican Dave Bolick when he is sworn in parts of January, as well as some other executive authorities, which Democrats and the gallery yesterday made clear they view as a political power grab ahead of Republicans losing their supermajority in 2025. The legislation also eliminates 2 Democrat-held judgeships and creates new positions appointed by the Republican-led legislature. The House and the Senate also approved a constitutional amendment requiring a photo identification for all voters. That's doing is simply aligning the Constitution with existing state law and enshrining that within the Constitution. Voters will decide whether they support that in 2026 when that's on the ballot. Critics argue the amendment could deter voters and create confusion, as we've come to understand from folks that are against voter ID, while polls indicate very strong support for this. Nearly 70% of folks are in favor of voter identification or some sort of way to verify who you are before you vote. Protesters, of course, made their voices heard at the General Assembly yesterday, chanting shame at the Republican lawmakers as they gave Governor Roy Cooper his 29th veto override, 29 for 29 on veto overrides for the North Carolina General Assembly. The office of the governor released this statement yesterday saying, quote, Western North Carolina's small businesses and communities still wait for support from the legislature while Republicans make political power grabs the priority. Shameful. You can read more on that story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m., right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.